Oh, great.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Mary. Uh, Mary, Mary, I have started to read your book.
No.
Yeah, I'm sorry it's taken me so long, but I've been really enjoying it. I haven't gotten too far, but I certainly like the beginning of it.
Well, thank you. Oh my gosh, I'm so honored that you're taking a peek at it.
No, I will get to it. I've had so many deadlines that um I really apologize for taking so long.
Not at all. No, I'm honored that you're looking at it, Lloyd. Thank you so much.
No, my pleasure. And thank you all for coming today. Uh Great to see you. I am seeing Jennifer, Catherine,
Oh,
Susan, David, Delia, Bill, thank you so much. Michael, great to see you. Ruth, uh, Mary, Wendell, Bill, David, Jonathan, Ted, Steve, how are you doing? You're muted.
I said, I'm a little bit better.
I am glad to hear that.
If you give me a reason to curse, I can say F's.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
uh, Rob, thank you for joining. Orlando, great. Tom and Gail. Um, well, thank you for joining. Um, so this is a poem that oh, Susan and Yehudi, I hope. Um, and This is a poem that's actually been on that we was on a list of poems a long time ago. So I think most of you haven't seen it. And then when we talked about it, it really got very short shrift, as I recall. Um, Hi, Catherine, Susan, Yehudi, great to see you. Um, I thought in it in and everyone, this is Derek, who will be our what shall we call it, co-anchor
Yes.
with Marita and at the Malden Library, which you can see behind Derek, and it's a spectacular place. I hope some of you can, designed by H. Richardson,
Yes.
and one of the most beautiful libraries I would say in the country, if not in the world. And maybe some of you can get to visit it. I know I am planning to in the new year. And thank you for hosting us today.
Yes. Thank you for being here, everyone. It's a pleasure to meet all of you.
Thank you. So we really didn't get to talk very much about this poem when we first did it, because it was on a list of a lot of poems about poetry. And I think most of you weren't even tuning in yet, because it was quite early in our discussion group. How many of you did? Jennifer, were you one of them? And Bill, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So I hope you don't mind going into a little more depth with this poem, and I may rely on you for answers to questions that I still have about it. So hi, Michael, and why don't I read the poem?
Greetings.
Greetings. So this is Poetry by Marianne Moore. I too dislike it. There are things that are important beyond all this fiddle. Reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers that there is in it, after all, a place for the genuine. Hands that can grasp, eyes that can dilate, hair that can rise if it must. These things are important, not because a high-sounding interpretation can be put upon them, but because they are useful. When they become so derivative as to become unintelligible, the same thing may be said for all of us, that we do not admire what we cannot understand. The bat holding on upside down or in quest of something to eat. Elephants pushing, a wild horse taking a roll, a tireless wolf under a tree. The immovable critic twinkling his skin like a horse that feels a flea. The baseball fan, the statistician, case after case could be cited did one wish it. Nor is it valid to discriminate against business documents and school books. All these phenomena are important. One must make a distinction, however, when dragged into prominence by half poets. The result is not poetry, nor till the autocrats among us can be literalists of the imagination, above insolence and triviality, and can present for inspection imaginary gardens with real toads in them. Shall we have it? In the meantime, if you demand on the one hand, in defiance of their opinion, the raw material of poetry in all its rawness, and that which is on the other hand genuine, then you are interested in poetry. Uh, do you like this poem? Hi, Pat.
I love it.
I love it.
Um, tell me what you like about it.
I like it because it's quirky. I like the fact that she starts out saying, I too dislike it. Sort of setting us up for a different kind of conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, it's kind of the most memorable moment in the poem. The poem has a number of memorable moments, but it's you see the title and you read the first line and oh, you're really stopped in your tracks.
It's very seductive. It would invite people who don't like poetry to read the poem.
Yeah. Yehudi?
Marianne Moore was, as far as I can understand, one of the most elusive and evasive poets I know, or people I know altogether. I never met her, of course. but her poetry is always disguised, full of disguises. And I think the truth of this poetry, of this poem, is that the real title is My Life.
Mhm.
Wow. Okay, I have to take that in. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, I think all the references have to do with the values that she espouses, that she loves, that she respects, and the things in life, in her life, in any artist's life that they dispute and reject. That's all. I mean, I don't see any particular profound moment, epiphany in the poem that would indicate that, but this is just my take on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just it comes from my experience with dealing with some of Marianne Moore's poetry, and this idea of her being elusive and evasive is, I think, really a particular mark of her craft and her life. A very strange life indeed, you know.
Yes.
Uh,
Jonathan,
Could
thank you.
we? I'd love to get a little more insight into the structure. It looks on the page very regular, and I see the couplets and the two short lines, and I'm not sure what other actual rhymes there are. But why is and I don't know Marianne Moore's poetry at all, so this is a start.
Jennifer,
Lloyd,
So-
yeah. I can try to speak to that.
please.
The structure that you're seeing is a syllabic structure. If you were to get in there and count, you would see that the opening line of each stanza has 19 syllables. The next line has 22, the next 11, the next 5, the next 8. It's a system that Moore used mostly for composing her stanzas. And I like Bishop's phrase for it. Elizabeth Bishop called it her invisible, inaudible abacus, because there is, maybe this goes to Yehudi's point about her being elusive. There's an ordering principle for her that matters, that is part of the compositional generating of the poem. She would like you to feel, probably just about to the extent that you did, that on the page it's simultaneously jagged but somehow regular. And that I think of it as invitational form. That is, it's not imposed on you, it's not overt, you don't feel a regularity, but there's a kind of intuition that there's an order behind it. Again, which to my mind doesn't have to be excavated. And sometimes she will include, as you've noticed with this one, that the middle lines have a rhyming pattern, a BBCC, although the first line and the last line don't rhyme with each other or anything else. And that's also typical. It's often the case that she'll have a stanza pattern with lines that are camouflaged by enjambment and no rhyme of any kind in the last line. So it's a little bit like the number system. There's a kind of a inflection towards order, but it doesn't ask you to land on it or hear it. She has an early poem about a jellyfish that I think invites and eludes in the same way. And it's a system she developed pretty early as a way of breaking out of a different kind of order. And one other thing I'd say about this poem, which I'm sure Lloyd would get to anyway, she revised it many times, and maybe 5 or 6 times. This version that we have is pretty close to the version that winds up in the definitive collection. But in one early edition, she shortened it to 13 lines, no syllabic stanza, no half rhyme. That was about 7 years after this one. And in Moore's lifetime, the way we would have found this version would be to look in the notes of an edition that published a 3-line version of it in the body of the text. So there's also, she goes back and forth. I just, Lloyd, if I could, with the version we have here that you've given us, the 1919 version, it's not the one that she settles on. It's the stanza pattern, but there are a few little changes, not all of which need to be pointed out, but some of which are fun to know. If you looked, that critic twinkling his skin becomes pretty soon, and for all versions thereafter, the critic twitching his skin, which is maybe a slightly less benign image of the critic. And the poem is inviting us to be or not be critics of a certain kind and follow our itches or twitches. The other one, which is in the second to last stanza, nor till the autocrats among us can be literalists of the imagination. Eventually, she takes out that word autocrats and replaces it with poets.
Oh.
Which I find interesting, partly because of the shift there, but also because poets is only 2 syllables, autocrats is 3, and it's not important to her to go ahead and regularize the line. So anyway, there's one other thing, that phrase in the last stanza, end of the second line, last stanza, in defiance of their opinion. She drops that too, and that stays out of later versions. Other than that, there's small punctuation things, but those are the ones that, but since it has to do with critics, poets, and defying opinions, I put them in not to correct them, but to show that she kept adjusting herself in terms of where she stood. And if I can be permitted one last line after a long discourse.
Please.
What I love about reading Moore is the way I feel pulled between her sentences, which are long and ongoing, and her specifics, which have such a gravitational pull and interest, and they're tasty. And I like the way I'm pulled towards the specifics as if they would break it up, but towards the promise of a sentence that might bring this all back together. But the fluidity of that back and forth, rather than the solving of it. Because that's, I think, where her generosity is. She says, these are things I love. I'm going to give them to you, but I'm not going to say they're mine. Here, take them and love them too. I'm going to engage you in the same process by which I discover them as the things I love. And what I actually love is the process of discovering and adjusting them. So.
Oh, thank you so much. That is so helpful. I was certainly going to mention 1 or 2 of the things that you did, but I don't think I have the eloquence that you just had to. Yeah, no, but truly,
You're just a country lawyer.
Yeah, right. But
Hmm.
I mean, I certainly remember being absolutely shocked when she changed this poem to poetry. I too dislike it. There are things that are important beyond all this fiddle. Reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers that there is in it, after all, a place for the genuine. And then that's it. And that was, I think that was her final version. And it's the version in her last volume of collected poems. And she just got rid of everything else. But it's in the appendix. This is my favorite version. So that's why I chose this version. And I really, Bill, are you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Please.
coming back to John's question, in part, I think she's playing a bit with, is this prose or is this poetry?
Yeah.
Because there's a specific reference to Tolstoy's journal where he's asking that question. He says, where the boundary between prose and poetry lies, I shall never be able to understand. The question is raised in manuals of style, yet the answer to it lies beyond me. Poetry is verse, prose is not verse. Or else poetry is everything with the exception of business documents and school books.
Oh, wow.
Jennifer, do you know if was Marion Moore the first poet to use syllabic verse?
In English?
Yeah,
Well, I will say so this is the same time that experiments with Eastern forms like the haiku and the tanka are coming in. I think she's the first to use it in this sort of generative way, where there is a regular syllabic count, but not one that you can arrive at as, in viscerally felt, and the haiku's use, what that did was almost always bring into American poetry a line shorter than the phrase or the sentence. That was the great innovation of syllabics, something that undid the way free verse would also undo kind of the podium of, say, a pentameter line or a regular form or a song. But I think Moore is the first one to use it like this without an additional rhyme scheme or metrical scheme. Some poets layer them on, but I think so. There are syllabic experiments at this moment, but mostly what they're doing is trying out the value in English of forms from other cultures. And I think this comes from a kind of botanical, biological, quasi-scientific interest in the hidden forms of the universe that come early in her life. But I think she's the first one to really use it this way.
yeah. It's a couple of things. One is that it was a form that continued after her, and that other people, other writers used it. I think especially of Richard Howard, who used it all the time, a lot of the time. Not
Also
all-
Tom Gunn. Tom
And
Gunn
Tom
got
Gunn.
it from her. Yeah.
Yeah. So some important poets, some significant poets, continued to use it. And yeah, and I would say the sort of play between, it's really very important that it looks like a poem. That on the page you look at it and you don't say, oh well, this is prose, or it's, you know, it's very formal. But the difference between syllabic verse and free verse, and really almost every other kind of formal poetic writing, is that the line breaks, the ends of the lines and the beginnings of the lines are really of minimal significance. That you see a free verse poem, and usually the word at the end of the line or the word at the beginning of the line has an extra kind of punch to it, has some indication of the importance of the, you know, verse means turn. So there's a turn at the end of every line. There's a turn at the end of every line of verse. And here, the turn is usually not so important as a turn. It's not as important as it looks on the page. Reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers that there is in it, after all, a place for the genuine. And I mean, it's not that there's never an importance in the turn, but there's a kind of minimal, it seems to me, there's a kind of minimal importance in what happens at the end or at the beginning of the line than just the way it looks on the page. That she's saying, this is a poem, although when you read it, it might not seem like any kind of poetry that you're used to, or even any kind of poetry at all, except that it has a shape to it. So it's very interesting. Bill Symes, do you look like you have
no,
some...
I was going to jump in. I was when you
Please.
asked if Marianne Moore is the original user of syllabics, it occurred to me that Robert Bridges' daughter, Elizabeth Dariush, I think probably precedes her chronologically. But I think what you say, I mean, my tendency is to read syllabics as a way of having form without having it.
Yeah.
I see it as tied up with Pound's, you know, first heave being to break the pentameter by abandoning accentual syllabics. One's capable of escaping from iambic tunes, but without going the whole hog and abandoning oneself to going on one's nerve, as vers libre would require. So syllabics enables you to retain a semblance of order without imposing on yourself something which is too regular and too restrictive or confining. With regard to, I think everything you say about the relative insignificance of the line breaks is true here. In other users of syllabics, it does retain importance, though. And Jennifer mentioned Tom Gunn. I think he still, in those poems in My Sad Captains, where he first has recourse to syllabics, precisely, I think, because he wants to escape from regularity, but isn't willing to risk free verse yet. His line breaks, I think, which are pointed up by rhyme, are quite often highly significant. I'm thinking of that the poem about considering a snail, for example, where he asks, what is the fury of a snail? All line break, as if the snail is angry, furious about everything, but all I think is that it is later, if I hadn't have seen, that kind of thing. So Gunn, I think, probably does accentuate the importance of line breaks in a way in which Marianne Moore doesn't. Anyway.
Catherine, thank you. Thank you, Bill.
You started out with a simpler question than we've gotten to, which is why
Okay.
do you like, do you like it or dislike it, and why do you like it?
Yeah.
And having never seen it before, I liked it for 3 reasons. It says it challenges as to this is high sounding interpretation, but you can't read it out loud unless you've read it before because of exactly those line breaks. So she's saying, it seemed to me, you want to be interested in poetry, pay attention. You have to pay attention. And then she's saying high sounding interpretation, but then she picks what's often considered the lowest of the low, baseball, being a baseball fan. And that's okay. But the thing I liked best, I too dislike it. Then you are interested in poetry. And suddenly, instead of being as kind of discourse on how fancy poetry is and why we love it and run it and don't or whatever, she's including us. And that seems to be why she's telling it, is don't be put off. We talk funny, but you like it.
Right. Right. Thank you. Yeah, that's very, I think that's really important about bringing the reader into the to the poem at the end of the poem. Yehudi.
Completely remarkable is the irrevocable structure of the syllabic counting, the number of syllables, and the vernacular, apparently spontaneous speech and flow of the language. Susan was saying to me the other day, what would it look like if it were just written as prose? Well, it wouldn't be a poem, it would be something else. But the structure, the tension between those two aspects, the spontaneity and the rigidity, is, I think, what makes it really great. And that one of the things is it's completely hidden in a way at first glance that there is such a structure. I mean, there is the structure of, it looks like a poem. You have 6 or 5 stanzas of equal length, but there's a lack of pretentiousness and kind of scholastic demonstration in the way she does, in what she does. And it's again, from my perception, part of her privacy, her elusiveness, and also a mark of her greatness.
Is it hidden though?
I think it's hidden. I think most people would not recognize immediately that there is this syllabic structure.
I mean, we were talking about leaves earlier, about there being something biological about the sort of irregular distribution of syllables, but if this is a leaf, it's a leaf where like the circulatory system just runs right into the surface and just spills everywhere. Like these line breaks are violent. It doesn't feel understated. If you break an infinitive across a stanza break, like I don't know. The sentences flow as if the sentences read as if prose. You can try to ignore the line breaks. You can try to give them as little weight as the natural flow of these sentences in prose would. But I mean, this is it feels to me like a very vivid and hostile order that is being imposed on top of the semantics, that totally cross-cuts it and violates it almost everywhere.
Wendell and then Catherine.
Well, this poem has for me, a quite mystical connection. And that's because I graduated from Topeka High School about 37 years before Benjamin Lerner graduated from Topeka High School. And he has a wonderful monograph that starts with an anecdote about trying to memorize this poem in the form of in the shortest form. It's a he talks about how all of his classmates are snickering as he keeps trying to recite the poem, and his teacher keeps prompting him, and nothing works. And that's because it doesn't have any of the traditional mnemonics that are associated with it. It's a wonderful monograph called The Hatred of Poetry. And it's because on some level, it expresses the love-hate relationship I have with the form. The number of times I've sat with a poem in a class and felt stupid because I had no idea what the poet is trying to tell me, right? And that occurs, and that's one of the things that she's addressing here, I think. So I can carry on a little bit. Because of that connection with my connection with Ben Lerner, it turns out, is mystically much more involved than just the discovery of his book on a pile of books at a bagel bar meeting one time. But and anybody who wants to talk to me about that, I can. But Lerner's take off from this poem and talking about poetry is really worth exploring.
Catherine?
You've invited us to talk about form, and that's what we've been doing. I found the vocabulary of this poem so puzzling. Gail said seductive. That first line, yes, I too, there are things that are important beyond all this fiddle. Well, all this fiddle promises a folksy kind of vocabulary that wouldn't put anybody off. And then right in the next line, she goes to, why does she switch to one, which in contrast to what was just said, I find pretentious always. I mean, and why didn't she stay with I? Or she could have said we. She's going to go to we later. We discovered that there is, that would have been more embracing. And then, although the poem itself seems to contradict what she seems to be saying. That is, she's advocating concrete hands that can grasp, eyes, hair, the various animals that and that I thought marvelous, the critic twinkling his skin. I'm sorry she ever thought to do that different. But these are vivid and yet the poem is filled with multisyllabic words that come, I know, business document, or I was thinking legal document. So I found that puzzling. And again, at the end, when she's saying rawness, that's what and then you are interested in, so then it becomes an elitist thing again. Okay, you qualify, you don't qualify, to be admitted to this. So I found that very puzzling, and, disequilibrating. The pull of the vocabulary seeming to be contradict the point she's made. And of course, when we finally get to that imaginary gardens with real toads, I mean, yeah, that's it. but so much of the other languages seems just laden with syllables.
I wonder.
Mary.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mary and then Bill.
Oh, yeah, I find that fascinating, Catherine, and I also am really fascinated by David's comment about the violence of the line.
Yes, I was too.
Yeah. And I don't know, this is, I don't know, my take on it, I guess. But I think both of those points are really great. I think that I really feel the sense of violence in it as well. But I think it works because it's tied to, well, I think maybe two things. One of the things that I associate with Marianne Moore is just the great love of precision. And I think that leads her to a kind of specialized vocabulary. Sometimes it's scientific, I don't know. But I kind of see that love of precision coming out in two different ways, and they're kind of at odds with each other. And one is the wish to make a pronouncement, like she does in those first three lines. And I was actually, that's one of the things, I'm so happy, by the way, that we're doing this poem, because I've struggled with this poem for decades. So thank you.
Yeah, me too.
But there's that kind of almost academic precision pronouncements like we see in the first three lines, and in these other moments that Catherine is pointing out, the vocabulary is kind of out of sync with some of the rest of the vocabulary. But it seems to me that kind of in opposition to that pronouncement, slightly almost academic kind of language, is the part of Moore that wants to just dig in and complicate whatever pronouncement she might be making, right? And kind of string it along. And that's where, you know, the imaginary gardens and that's where the animals and the kind of the more immediate imagery comes in contrast to that kind of more, I have an opinion, you know, a highly evolved opinion, and I'm going to share it with you, and this is how it is. I don't know. Anyway, I like the poem already so much better than I ever have in the past. So I'm just going to say thank you already for this.
Okay, great. Bill, what were you going to say?
Oh,
thank you.
Well, I was thinking that argumentatively or discursively, the poem is also rather slippery and elusive. It seems to have an argumentative structure, but when you try to analyze it or pin it down, it's terribly difficult to do so. For example, the hands and the eyes and the hair in the first stanza seem to be introduced as examples of poetry as providing a place for the genuine, but are they identifying authentic objects to be included in poetry, or are they rather the responses, the sort of physical, visceral, bodily responses engendered by poetry, which possesses the kind of authenticity she desiderates? Then in the second stanza, we have this peculiar opposition between the derivative and the intelligible. That's not a continuum which I've ever really considered, as if too much derivativeness leads to unintelligibility. I would have thought too much derivativeness leads to banality or tedium or something. So that's very strange. And then when the bat and the elephants and the other animals and eventually the critic come in, they in terms of the unfolding of the argument, they could either be an example of utility, the utility which value has been attached to, but they could also be an example of things we don't understand. It's not quite clear how far they reach back in the poem and what they're meant to be illustrating. And all through the poem, it seems to me, we're struck by an argumentative or a seeming argumentative orderliness, but one which evaporates or dissipates as soon as you try to specify it. And in a way, that tension is analogous to the tension we noticed in terms of metrics, just as syllabics provide an order, but one which is elusive and unemphatic. So the argumentative orderliness refuses ever to crystallize into something substantive.
I was going to say, I just wanted to say, I mean, thank you all. This is so illuminating. And your question, Catherine, you're interesting to land on the word one in the second line as a kind of change in tone, in diction. And I think that happens throughout the poem, along with well, last time talking about Dylan Thomas, who is obviously couldn't be more different from Marion Moore, but the difficulty of the syntax, and which I find challenging also, along the lines of Bill's question. But it's sort of, I think this must be how Marion Moore talked, or as a kind of projection of herself, of her own voice, that it can it contains multitudes, and that she is, yeah, she's sort of like Robert Frost in the first line, all this fiddle, and then she's the sort of professorial, one discovers that there is in it after all, and then suddenly we get these very sort of physical hands that can grasp, eyes that can dilate, hair that can rise if it must. These things are important. And then she's really sort of being the poet, looking at the almost at the actual physical responses to reading a poem, and then hair that can rise if it must. These things are important not because a high sounding interpretation can be put upon them, and then she's sort of, in a way, she's sort of attacking the voice that she has been writing in, that she's been speaking in. And we know that she doesn't admire a high sounding interpretation, that's the wrong way to look at a poem, and that she's very slippery and kind of all over the place. And that's very it's very elusive, and it's really one of the things that's so difficult about Marion Moore, and that's also so attractive about her, that just as the syllabic verse is both very formal and then on the other hand almost like prose, but then there are the two short lines rhyme in every stanza, and she's doing so many things at the same time, and I think most of them are conscious, but I don't know. And I'm not sure whether she's just sort of letting it all hang out. And then when she revises it, she does weird things, and she, as Jennifer pointed out, that she disregards the syllabic structure and uh um and
Can I ask you a rather specific question? Because I
sure.
wanted to take advantage of the presence of so many Americans. I, in the
Words are not often spoken.
with that reference to hair that can rise if it must, at that point we might be finding images of the physical response of the reader to authentic poetry, as opposed to items which appear in authentic poetry. And hair rising as an image of the authentic makes me, as an English reader, steeped in Houseman, think of his test of real poetry. Houseman said once that he had to be careful when shaving in the morning not to allow a line of poetry to enter his head, lest it cause his hairs to bristle and impede the progress of the razor through the beard. But is it possible that Moore was thinking of that, or is A. Houseman someone Americans just don't really take account of?
Oh, I think Houseman would have been extremely popular, especially around that time.
Oh, okay.
And I don't know whether Moore wrote about Houseman at all, but I'm sure she read Houseman, and Houseman was almost a school book
okay.
In America. And I had to read Houseman, and you know,
and he feels enormously English to me. I didn't realize that he had a reputation on the other side of the Atlantic.
Enormously popular here.
Well, even without the Houseman allusion, or without knowing it, still, I mean, my hair stood on, the cliche, my hair stood on end. I thought that this is among the various elements of this poem. When hearing you read it, it made me smile. Hair that can rise, the image is something involuntary. My hair stood on end. And then hair that can rise if it must, as if
it must.
If the hair were, had free will,
And yeah, and if it must is just so, it's kind of funny.
It is funny.
Yeah.
But hair raising.
Oh yeah.
Go ahead,
hair
Bill.
raising is consistent with David Donna's point about the violence. There's things that are hair raising are scary.
Jonathan.
Lloyd, I thought your bringing up Dylan in this context was interesting, because there's part of me that reads this and wants to have whole poems with lines like "the immovable critic twinkling his skin like a horse that feels a flea." That's wonderful, but it seems kind of isolated. But then I think, somebody like Dylan, who was a famous drunk and out of control person, and he could get away with that. And Marianne Moore couldn't have gotten away with that. That she, I think she was under. I think some of these lines talk about the kind of constraints that she was under. So it's not. It doesn't. That kind of freedom that some other poets have felt like it was okay for them to claim. It feels like she's pulled back from that.
I wanted to chime in on, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting now, who was it? We've had such a fun little round here. Bill's point about Houseman. I also hear, and I don't usually do this, it reminds me of this, or it sounds like that, but hands that can grasp seems I immediately think of the Keats poem, This Living Hand, that uses actually almost the same language. This living hand, now warm and capable of earnest grasping. And it makes me, I get the feeling, well, it's interesting. Lloyd mentioned it could be the reader's response to the poem, but I think it's also the ingredients of poems. You know, that, and the Keats poem is a great example of that. The hand is right there and it's offered. Anyway, but I love the way that these elements or ingredients go both ways. And she gets
Great,
some
yeah.
reactions from us too. Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, what were you gonna say about baseball?
I need an hour.
Well, start anyway.
Well, I was just thinking that the idea of the structure of baseball was so appealing to her too. But when you think of her loving baseball, you think of her loving the young men in their uniforms and the, you know, the whole, whatever we all love about baseball. But I just thought there were a lot of analogies to the structure of baseball with her self-invented structure in this poem particularly.
I mean, she was a baseball fanatic. And
Dodger
Yehudi,
The Dodger.
Yeah. Oh, I just wanted to ask you a question, Lloyd. Does Elizabeth Bishop, who was such a friend, have any comments that would be germane to this poem or her procedure in general?
not that I know of. And Elizabeth Bishop was really a kind of disciple of Marianne Moore, and she is often compared to Marianne Moore, not so much in this poem, but because Marianne Moore wrote a lot of poems about animals, and so did Bishop. Bishop was very circumspect about commenting on Marianne Moore's poems. Marianne Moore regularly commented to Bishop on Bishop's poems, and she regarded Bishop as a kind of, you know, acolyte and student. I mean, she wasn't officially a student, but she was younger than Bishop, and Bishop really admired Moore until Moore suggested a lot of changes in one of Bishop's major poems, which she then published, ignoring all of Moore's suggestions, and that they had a serious falling out as a result of that. That Bishop just refused all of Moore's suggestions, but it didn't go the other way around. And I'm not aware of very much Bishop commentary on Moore.
How much do we know about Marianne Moore's mother, who lived with her, and every poem she wrote up to the time of her mother's death, and no doubt, if my relationship with my mother is any indication, long after her death, had to be on her head about what was right and wrong about the poem.
Well, Bishop Moore's mother she certainly participated in her comments on Bishop, and I assume on just about everything else. And even weirder than Moore living with her mother for her entire life was that she was sleeping with her mother. They slept in the same bed. And that, I, I find that a little chilling.
It's called incest.
I don't think it was
odd.
sexual. I don't think it was sexual in any way, but I don't know what goes on behind closed doors.
And how interesting that Bishop was drawn to her, who herself saw her mother for the last time when she was 5 or 6 years old, and then and didn't see her again till ever.
The one, Catherine?
Minor. When I'm stuck on hair that can rise, if it must. Men have been writing about women's hair being out of place since I think writing was invented, or maybe women were invented. I don't know which came first. In the back eye, he comments that the women take down their hair, and it's always a sign of, to have loose hair is always a sign of being independent and whatever. And I just thought that sounded like a warding off a criticism from her, that she's saying, I'm going to use this style, and you can comment on it, but it's on purpose.
Hair raising.
Well, no, hair raising has to do with fright. Several of us in this group have big hair. And I suspect many of us have been told, can't you put a bobby pin in that? Can't you do something to make it look tidy? You know, and I learned to avoid those people eventually because it was tedious. And I couldn't do anything, you know.
I get that too.
I bet you do. But I think it's a kind of, you know, hair's hair. It's what it is. Leave me alone.
But I do think she's talking about, or she's writing about poems that do make your hair stand on end. And who is talking about Jonathan, was it you who were talking about, no, I'm sorry, talking about phrases that just stood out that you know, that you admired or loved?
Yes.
Yeah. And then, you know, people who you know, who know this poem or who quote this poem, the things that they quote are, I too dislike it, literalists of the imagination, and imaginary gardens with real toads in them. And those are the lines that, I think those are the lines that people who quote unquote know this poem, those are the lines that they know and that they quote. And they are the most, really, in some ways, the most poetic lines in the poem, and that they they kind of leap out of this very sort of complicated syntax where it's even hard to actually place what they're, you know, what they mean in context. And it's certainly one of the challenges of this poem. Yeah.
I wanted to say, just in response to what Catherine said, that hair hair raising can be fright, but it can also be that kind of frisson of just an intense experience that you're recognizing as something you've experienced, something that's spectacular in some way, much more pleasurable than fright.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You had
Yeah.
begin.
Yehudi? Susan?
Susan.
Oh, yeah, Susan.
I just had a couple of questions. In the second stanza, the high sounding interpretation can be put upon them, but because they are useful.
Yes.
That is such a strange word, and it's as if she, the poet with her craft, is undermining everything she's talking about in some powerful way in the poem. The other question I had, or comment, was why did she put in quotes literalists of the imagination? Is that a quote, or is it from somebody else, or is that just to set it off?
I think it's Yeats on Blake, isn't it?
It's, yeah, Yeats on Blake, but it's a misquotation.
Oh,
He says something like a too literal realist of the imagination is the Yeats quote, or something close. Yeah.
thank
So
you.
it's a misquotation, but an improvement. He was a too literal realist of imagination, as others are of nature, is apparently the quote.
Great.
Know where that's from?
An essay of Yeats on Blake's
On Blake.
Wow.
illustrations to the Divine Comedy.
A note about about their being useful. The hands that can grasp so that you can hold on to a weapon, eyes that can dilate so you can see the threat, hair that rises because it makes you larger, makes you more frightening in facing your fears.
Wow.
No.
Really interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah, I have to think about that.
Can I ask a question, Lloyd,
Yes.
about the final turn in the poem?
Okay.
Because I don't really catch the significance of on the one hand and on the other hand, because that seems to invite an opposition, and yet the two things which are introduced are typically things which we think of as almost synonymous: a preservation of raw material in its raw condition, an estual of poetic transfiguration, and the genuine might be thought of as coincident or convergent, and yet here they're set apart and made antithetical, and that seems to typify her invocation of an argumentative or discursive order, but her filling it out in a way which somehow subverts and undermines it.
I have given a lot of thought to that.
Good.
What I think what I originally, I mean, I think what you are meant to think of, or that what you can meant is maybe the wrong word for Marion Moore, but what you can't help thinking that this is a disjunction, that this is a contrast, and that I have come to accept it as a conjunction of a kind of reconciliation of opposites, kind of Coleridgean reconciliation of opposites, that it's got this is its quality, and on the other hand, it also has this quality that that there is raw material in all its rawness, but also something that is genuine. And genuine, of course, is a key word uh, in the poem, because it 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 comes at the end of the third line. One discovers that there is in it, after all, a place for the genuine. And the genuine, I mean, if you regard the poem in its later version as only those three lines, that genuine really hits you as a completely positive element in poetry, that it has to be genuine, and that all the kind of highfalutin academic interpretations of poems that are so derivative as to become unintelligible are just that's the that's the garbage, that's the trash, that's the wrong thing about poetry, that the genuine is what's the key thing. And that's the word she comes back to at the very end of the poem. And the odd thing, as you are, I think, absolutely right in speculating about, and that I have shared that speculation, that on the one hand and on the other hand, I think finally means you have both hands. And that the raw material is really important. And in a way, it's the raw material that makes your hands grasp and eyes dilate and hair stand on end. And that, but that it has to be, on the other hand, it has to be turned. You can't just present the raw material, that there has to be this other side to it, of what is genuine, what is a genuine subject for poetry, or what is a genuine treatment of poetry. And maybe I'm just thinking out loud now, and you may disagree with me, that it's that combination that sort of that she is demonstrating in the whole poem, that all its rawness has something to do with the number of syllables in each line, and all the sort of talk in the poem that goes beyond the line breaks and the stanza breaks, and it's all, there's a kind of rawness in the poem, but that she has put it together in a way that, on the other hand, is also genuine. And then you are interested in poetry. And so it's actually, you're right about the you, and the you is us, and the one discovers is really a kind of abstraction, but that it's our experience, it's your experience, that is what either makes the poem or not. And I think her kind of all over the placeness is part of that leap from rawness to what is genuinely poetry. I don't know, does that make sense? Or
Yeah, no, it's helped. It's helped.
Stick up your hand now. Peter.
Lloyd?
yeah, please.
Well, thinking about what you said, it made me wonder if this was partly a not a refutation, but a counter to the imagists. As a modernist, is she trying to say, no, you're going to go too far? You know, the intellection of one style of poetry, which she's clearly valuing, and she's also valuing the imagism, but saying the doctrine that would lead you only in one way would be too much rawness, not enough humanness. I think it makes me feel like the utility, she says, is a whole mind that does what a mind does, because that puts you in your life, as opposed to saying, no, I can only take this path or that path.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, there's some target in this poem that we don't explicitly know, but it could be that too. It very well. Peter, you had your hand up before.
Thank you.
Unmute. Yeah.
Thank you. I wondered in the second stanza, what do we make of "we do not admire what we cannot understand"? I wonder if people can comment on how that relates to both what came before and what comes after, and particularly in the light of, I don't actually believe that at all as an assertion.
Well, yeah, I mean, it could be a sort of a dangerous assertion when we are dealing with this poem.
Especially me.
But yeah, what do you make of that? Because that's a sort of challenging thing to say. That poems, when they become so derivative as to be become unintelligible, the same thing may be said for all of us, that we do not admire what we cannot understand.
It's rather coercive, isn't it? And this maybe goes back to, I think it was Catherine's point about the peculiar use of one. Maybe retrospectively, we can see the choice of one there and the avoidance of we as enabling her to introduce this we, which operates coercively and imputes to us all an alleged agreement with the idea that we can't admire what we don't understand, when in reality that isn't the case at all. And she must know full well that she's flying in the face of a large body of authority pointing in the other direction. You know, Eliot saying that genuine poetry communicates before it's understood. Stevens thinking that poetry resists the intelligence almost successfully, and so on. There's a whole tradition of thinking of.
I think there's a difference between don't understand and cannot understand. Don't understand, you know, that's, and her choice of cannot understand, that there's something about it that is baffling, no matter what skills you have.
Yeah, and in the list that follows, she resorts to nature and phenomena of, I mean, really strange phenomena of animals, and
including the statistician.
Including the statistician, but then she also includes the baseball fan. So she's including herself in her passion for something that, you know, maybe is incomprehensible to I mean, in a way, baseball fans are often very similar to statisticians. You know, people who know the batting average and I mean,
Oh,
and all the things I don't understand. Mary?
they're employed by baseball. Major League Baseball always have statisticians in their
Right,
roster.
but I'm thinking about the baseball fans
Yeah.
who know all the statistics of the game.
She's also sliding toward Tolstoy's phrase, which she had copied into her own journal, the one about business documents, his term, and school books, because he'd seemed to be saying they're not poetry, and I think she's raising a question about how seriously to take that division.
Right, Mary?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, I really loved I love the moment here where she says, the same thing may be said for all of us. At that moment, she seems to be saying, yeah, we're all, at least at times, I mean, okay, maybe very rarely Marianne Moore, but maybe even Marianne Moore has moments where she's so derivative that she becomes unintelligible. So I love Bill's word about coercive. But anyway, so I got a real chuckle. I love that moment. And it's not until we get to the next line that we're kind of absolved of that, you know, of that derivativeness or that failing, right? That we do not admire what we cannot understand. But for that little moment, we are, yeah, we're culpable in that unintelligibleness, which I just really like.
Do you think that the Nobel-winning poet Bob Dylan might have been referring to this when he said, and don't criticize what you can't understand?
Well, I wouldn't put it past him. I wouldn't put it past him. So anyway, I know you are interested in poetry, and you all, and I know Derek is, if you have, we need to close up shop in a couple of minutes. But if you have any last comments about this, we didn't go through the whole poem, partly because there are things in it that I'm still working on and trying to figure out. But I do like the poem, and I am interested in poetry and in the genuine, and any last comments or questions, Yehudi?
A comment, if any of you have any interest in music, you might be interested in the fact that years ago, when Susan was conducting the Wellesley Chorus, she asked me to write some pieces for women, and I wrote a series of 4 poems, starting with "Oh to be a Dragon," followed by "Chameleon," followed by "Jellyfish," followed by "Chameleon," and finally to Pluto, and Victor Hugo, a poem about her crow and about the imagination. And all of these kinds of things that we've been discussing are somehow engaged in these tiny but really potent poems. And I'm very proud of the kind of vernacular style that I used in composing this for women's chorus and piano. Recorded wonderfully on an archival recording of the Wellesley Chorus. And I don't know if it's where it's available or how you'd be able to listen, but if anyone is interested, if you get in touch with us, we can make it available to you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
That sounds beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that would be great. That would be great. And well, thank you all for coming today, and happy holidays to everyone, and happy New Year. And we will see what surprises I can come up with in the new year. And Derek, thank you. I don't know whether you'll be with us in January or Marita will be back, but thank you so much for making this available today. We're really very, very grateful to you, and I am very grateful to you. So thank you.
Thank you all. And yeah, even if Marita is hosting the event, I'll definitely come next time. This was a great experience for me to meet you all and hear all your comments. This has been very insightful.
Right.
They're great, aren't they?
Yes,
Yeah.
they are. They really are.
And you are too.
Thank you,
Thank
Lloyd.
you.
Thank
Oh,
you.
well, thanks. Thanks for coming today, and see you all soon.
Thank you, Lloyd.
Good.
Bye, everyone.
Happy New Year to us all.
Happy New Year.
Apropos that, you could say too.
Well, thank Derek. Really, what a pleasure to meet you, and thank you so much for hosting us today, and I hope to meet you in person, probably in the new year, probably, and the earlier the better.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great to have you and anyone else who'd like to come to see the library.
Rick, are you a poet?
Am I? Yeah, I like to write just a little bit. I mean, it's more of a hobby than anything, but yes, I am.
Bravo.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
We learn so much from what this group has to say. I've said it many times that this is a poem that's a hard poem for me, but I'm very interested in. But there are poems that I assume that I just know.